As Casey said, my name is Mary Weiss. I will be the moderator for our conversation this afternoon. We are very fortunate indeed to have Allison Pataki with us, the author of her recently published and acclaimed novel, The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post. Alice has written 9 books. 6 are historical fiction novels of women, 2 are children's books, and 1 is a nonfiction book she co-authored with her brother. We are also joined by Deborah Royce, a friend of Allison's and author of, and I'm going to use Deborah's own words, identity thrillers that examine puzzles of identity and the secrets that
hey, are we going to work it out so that
Are we having a little bit of interference, Casey? Okay.
Taken care of, Mary.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Deborah's 3rd book is called Reef Road. It was just released on January 10th, 2023, and Bryant Sims, a fellow Historical Society docent. Deborah will offer her perspectives as an author on Allison's book, and Bryant will share some personal reminiscence of being at Marjorie's parties at Mar-a-Lago. I'd like to start off the conversation this afternoon with a rhetorical question for our audience. Pretend you are at a bookstore or surfing online for your next book, and you come across these 2 most recent book covers, one of Deborah's and one of Allison's. I don't know if you can show those, Casey, but it would be interesting to see them. There's Allison's.
Oh, I'm going to go get mine. Hang on.
Okay, please do. Please do.
There
they are. There they are. We have them up now. All right. Now, ask yourself what you know about these books by Allison and Deborah by just looking at their covers. Should we judge these books by their covers? Is your curiosity piqued? Do you want to know more? Allison, your cover shows a woman with her back turned who seems to be elegantly dressed, wearing long gloves, which I haven't seen in a while myself, and a blue evening gown with the book title superimposed on the woman. Mm-hmm. What are you trying to convey by this cover?
Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Deborah, for joining us, and Bryant, and thank you to everyone at the 4 Arts. And I'm just thrilled to be here in a place that was close to Marjorie Merriweather Post's heart and is an integral piece of the story as well. And so that's a really, really great question, because we all do it, right? Whether we mean to or not, we can't help but judge a book by its cover, and the visual has to pop out and grab our attention. And what I love so much about historical fiction, many things, but one thing in particular is that it takes the dry, raw material of history and allows the reader to enter into these moments and to enter into the bedroom and the dining room and to sit, with these characters, inhabit their world. While it's fiction, the aim always is not only to educate and entertain, but also to get at the heart and the truth, hopefully, of the story. And so what I wanted this book the cover to capture is that this is a work of historical fiction, but it leaves a lot to the imagination. So we don't actually fully see the woman, Marjorie Merriweather Post. This is not a biography where we are looking at her face in an old black and white photo. But with the title there, with The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post, one of the main points here was that this was a woman who lived an epic, larger than life experience. She lived decades. She lived on the front lines of history. She had an active hand not only in witnessing history, but in shaping it. And so it was more than one life. Marjorie lived many lives rolled into one over the course of the entire almost 20th century. So The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post. And then you have this woman who is an elegant, gracious hostess, as Marjorie was, but I didn't want it to be specifically situated in one particular decade or era, because you have Marjorie in the World War I era, you have Marjorie in the Great Depression, you have Marjorie in World War II, you have Marjorie as a hostess and in the Soviet Union, and in the Cold War in the 1950s, 60s, all the way up to the 70s. So I wanted it to be elegant and gracious, but ambiguous in terms of the time period. But that this woman, who was known as America's hostess and as America's empress and the Duchess of DC, this is going to be a woman who throws a fabulous party. And I think you can get that in the photo. And funny story, we had a different dress picked out initially, and I was scrolling through social media and I saw a really old backlist title of a friend of mine, a peer author, who was like, hey, this book that came out 10 years ago, it was so long ago that the photo she'd used in the cover had come up and the licensing was available again. And so I went to my publisher. I was like, was this the dress we were thinking of using on the cover? Because I see that there's already a historical fiction book cover. Anyway, we were scrambling at the last minute because of that, but it ended up being a blessing in disguise because we landed on this one as a result. And I just love this. And Marjorie was known for having these beautiful piercing blue eyes. One of her nicknames was Blue Eyes. So I felt like the colors just popped perfectly as they had to be. So that's in a nutshell how we landed on the art and the title.
Well, it's a fascinating story. So often some authors don't have the participation in the creativity and design of their book covers. And this one certainly brings out who Marjorie is and the sort of a timelessness of her character. Thank you so much for explaining that. Deborah, the back of Allison's book, which is fairly typical, has a number of so-called author praises. How would you write one for Allison in this book?
Oh, oh, off the cuff. Well,
Yes.
me, I would say that the book is both historically sweeping and very richly detailed. And so those are two things that I think fit together in the perfect way in Allison's book. So not only are you getting the big sweeps of the 20th century, which, let's face it, was a very interesting century, but you also know exactly how this little girl came to Battle Creek, Michigan, what was wrong with her father, the boarding house they stayed in, how in this crazy story they started making cereal. Those are the things that kept me turning pages. Her life in Russia, how she came to be this collector of these very fine Fabergé porcelain pieces. And, you know, the way she's ushered into this kind of coarse warehouse where they're just stockpiling this stuff. That's what I think keeps you turning the pages. So I like the juxtaposition of the big wide world and the minutely personal.
I'd like to say that I've gotten to know Marjorie after reading your book, Allison.
Thank you.
Deborah, your book cover is also up here too, and I think it's quite a contrast to Allison's. Reef Road has these vibrant colors, but what I did notice was a spider perched on a tropical plant. Now, I got to be careful here because you've warned me before. I've had the pleasure of speaking with you before about your other two books, that I should avoid any spoilers. So I just wanted to know, does this spider have any significance?
Very much so. And our cover came about, the covers are very, very specifically designed. And if you were to take my cover, a black background with a bird of paradise flower centered right in the middle in smaller scale, it would look like literary fiction. It would look beautiful and pretty, and to use that word again, almost like a piece of porcelain. What you have here is the flower is off center. It's looming into the words so much where if you look at my name, Goodrich, the CH, the letters are being stabbed by a leaf. There's a violence, there's a motion, and there's a starkness, and there's a spider. So yes, we worked very hard to have something that was both beautiful and wrong. There's something wrong with it, and the spider should give you an indication that things are not all as they should be on Reef Road in Palm Beach.
All right, we'll leave it at that, but I think that's enough to pull in quite a number of readers who haven't yet read the book or haven't finished it. I'm also always interested in how authors structure their books. And we've now seen that Reef Road and the book about Allison's book are very different. One's historical fiction, one's a thriller, but yet you start off and you structure your books very similarly. And I know that you both have epigraphs, and prologues. And Allison, your epigraph, you have two quotes, one from Marjorie about her wealth, and another one by John Keats on beauty. Why did you introduce your book with these two quotes?
This book, to zoom out, it covers, we start in the late 1800s, as Deborah so beautifully put, in Battle Creek, Michigan, in the most humble of circumstances, and we end in Mar-a-Lago in 1973 with Marjorie Merriweather Post greeting the president, who is just the latest in a number of presidents she's hosting, as America's unofficial empress. So we cover a lot of ground, and we cover many decades, and this was by far the most challenging book I've ever written because of just the sheer scope. I knew I needed to start sort of at the dawn of the food empire that the Post family launches and really bring it up to the end of her life, because there's just that much good stuff happening the entire way through. And so to have that immense of a scope, it was overwhelming. It took me 6 years, and we're covering a lot of ground. So the two quotes that I selected to go at the beginning are sort of just to put a fine point on what this story is and where we are going. The first is Marjorie. You're hearing from her herself, and just the legacy that she still has, and the way she used her privilege and her power and her wealth to make the world a better place for so many. And then Marjorie really loved, Marjorie was authentic, and she was gritty and raw, and she was herself, in spite of the privilege and the beautiful, at times, luxurious life that she had. She loved beautiful things, but she also just wanted to make the world a more beautiful place, a more, I guess, fair, just place for everybody she knew and for those she didn't know. And so those two quotes to me sort of summed up her story, summed up the legacy that she left, and hopefully set the stage for the reader as to where exactly we're going to be going. And we're going to be covering a lot of ground here.
Well, it certainly was intriguing. You too, Deborah, begin your book with two epigraphs. Do you believe epigraphs add value for your reader? And did they do this for Allison?
Absolutely. I love to, I think our readers are very, very smart. And I also think our readers have a sense of humor. So one of the quotations I use at the beginning is from the novelist Dennis Lehane. And it's something like, in Greek tragedy, they fall from great heights. In noir, they fall from the curb. So that's fabulous. That, where you're going to go down a peg here, where people, this is not Marjorie Merriweather Post. These are people behaving badly. It's, so I think it sets a perfect tone. And I think it's a great search and hunt that writers can go on to find these little winks to share with the reader.
I think they're both very enticing. And Allison, I understand, not being in the writing world, but doing quite a bit of reading, that there is an ongoing debate now among writers whether prologues have a place in fiction. Both you and Deborah have used prologues after your epigraphs. Obviously, you believe in that they are appropriate, but why did you have one in this novel?
I love prologues that take you out of the chronology. And so for me, the prologue is happening at the very end of the book. And it's sort of like a teaser and amuse-bouche of, hey, this is where we're going to end up. And it seems really unlikely and improbable based on where we're starting. And so to me, it sort of gives the story that forward thrust, that urge to jump right in. And I enjoy them. They come to me, and I go with my gut. And in this case, I just saw Marjorie as an older woman at the height of her powers, having this moment where she's receiving the president into her Mar-a-Lago sitting room, and she's receiving the reader into this story, and hopefully whetting everyone's appetite to see how we're going to end up there.
Well, your opening sentence was quite dramatic. It reads, "Mrs. Post, the president and first lady are here to see you." How dramatic can that be? As a reader, I realized that this is an important woman. The presidents of the wives came to her house.
Exactly.
She didn't go to the White House. And in this instance, I believe it was Lyndon Johnson. So once again, I wanted to know more about her. I wanted to know, who is this woman? of course, I've heard of her for years, but didn't know much about her. This is so clever and well crafted. Did it just kind of like come to you, or did you labor over this to get the right opening sentence?
I would say the answer is somewhere in the middle. I certainly labored over it, but this scene did come to me as the way we were going to start the story. And as you said, um, certainly went. Marjorie Post went to the White House a number of times. She was invited there, but the presidents also came to her. And the presidents of the United States, you know, they change every 4 to 8 years, but Marjorie stayed at her post as America's empress for decades and evolved through all of the great history of the time. And so really she wields this power in that dynamic, which is an interesting thing to think about, because you're welcoming, you know, the most powerful person in the country, if not the, you know, one of the most powerful people in the free world, and she's receiving them, and they are overwhelmed by her, and they are cowed by her home. And ultimately, when Marjorie Merriweather Post offers Mar-a-Lago as a winter White House to the United States government and offers Camp Topridge to the state of New York, the government is overwhelmed at how they are going to be able to keep it up and do the job that Mrs. Post has been doing on her own, not on her own, with an incredibly skillful sort of staff that almost felt like her family, but still she was managing to do what the federal government ultimately decided they could not do. And so just shows you what kind of a woman you are dealing with.
Well, you know, it's interesting because we talked about the opening sentence. I think that's, you know, in the late 68 or so. And then we receive that same sentence, and most of that chapter is repeated again in chapter 51. I've never quite seen that before. What was your purpose in doing that?
So I'm just giving a little teaser. I'm giving a little kernel of the story of what is to come. And then ultimately at the very end of the book, we get there and we see, oh, this is how we got there. And these are the points that have connected us to here. So that's the first time I've ever done it that way, but that was the way this story came to me.
Well, it was interesting for me because I'm like, oh my gosh, I've read the sentence before. What is it? And then I quickly realized what it was. Deborah, many of our writers today do not go in chronological order, as Allison did in her book. They bounce back and forth between one time period and another, different characters of different eras. But in your recent book, Reef Road, it seems that you do that. You go from one time period, not as broad a time period. And why did you think it was appropriate to do that sort of approach in your book?
Well, so as Allison was talking, I kept thinking about the movie Citizen Kane. And if you think about that, it begins with him at the end of his life and dropping, I think he drops a snow globe or something, and he says Rosebud. And it's so tantalizing because, you know, now you're going to go backwards and then come back to where you are, return to the moment where the movie begins. And I think that's a very clear example of why it's so effective. So in Reef Road, it is playing out in Palm Beach, mainly during the COVID lockdown in spring of 2020. It begins with the prologue. And like Allison said, this particular prologue is not even part of the main story. It's not the main characters. It's two boys sneaking out onto Reef Road Beach in the middle of the day, crossing the do not enter tape and finding something that they don't even know how they can say they've found because they're not supposed to be out. They find a human hand. So it begins the book with a bang. You know, again, like the spider, all is not well in Palm Beach, Florida. And then you go back and you start to layer by layer look at what happened. And I do change times because I'm writing a thriller and things will be revealed in incremental fashion. I can take you up to certain points, but then I want to bring you back a year and let's look a little more at where we're going until it sort of comes to a crescendo where the reader is surprised to find out what's actually going on. So I think it's very effective. One of the things I tend to do is date and timestamp chapters when I'm doing that, because I think it can be helpful to the reader to know when and where are we. They don't have to worry about it. It's there for them.
That was very helpful, but I did have to do one of those little genealogy graphs to figure out who's the daughter and the brother and the sister and the aunt of everyone else. So it forced me to do that discipline, but I appreciated your chapters. They were two within one, I believe. And so we would alternate different perspectives. I wouldn't want to give too much away. I'm sorry. Allison, the first chapter of your book opens in 1891 when Marjorie and her father, Charles W., and her mother, Ella Merriweather, are living in Battle Creek. I think we have some earlier pictures of Marjorie from our Historical Society of Palm Beach County archives. The one on the left, as I'm looking at it, is Marjorie with her dad. What was that relationship like between Marjorie and her dad?
Probably the great love of her life. A very complicated, at times tragic, fraught relationship. But I think, I always say Marjorie fundamentally changed the American way of life, and she impacted your life and she impacted everyone's life. And that is true if you own a refrigerator or if you've ever eaten food that's been refrigerated or frozen. And I don't know that people necessarily know the full extent of Marjorie and the Post legacy and impact. But what happened was her father, C.W. Post, and Marjorie and her mother, they roll up to Battle Creek at the end of their hopes. And C.W. Post is at death's door going to get treatment as a last resort at the sanitarium of Dr. Harvey Kellogg. And if you know the name Kellogg, if that trips any bells, it's the cereal Kellogg, food. And so what happened was while C.W. Post was being treated by Dr. Kellogg, he had the idea that, hey, this ready-made granola cereal type stuff you're serving to the patients here at the SAN, this could really catch on as a business, as an industry. And Dr. Kellogg, as the Posts relay it, basically laughed him off the premise and said, there's no way that, we serve this at the SAN, but the public, the American public, would never want to eat something like this cereal for breakfast. And C.W. Post took a chance and thought Dr. Kellogg was wrong and launched this cereal empire in a wide public way. And cereal took off. Go figure. We've all probably had a bowl of cereal. Grape Nuts was one of his very first products, as was Post Toasties, which you have there. And this, of course, sparked this enmity and this rivalry with the Kellogg's, who felt that the Posts had taken their idea and they were, carpet bagging imposters. And the Post said, well, hey, you never wanted to actually market it as a viable public industry. So there was this rivalry, but the Post and the Kellogg's come up together in Battle Creek, known as, it becomes Cereal City, USA. And then the Posts take this idea of a ready-made, convenient, healthy meal after changing the entire framework of breakfast, and they apply it to the rest of the day. And it's Marjorie who has the idea to buy this small little Massachusetts company run by Clarence Birdseye, who freezes fish and other products. And the men, the business experts, the board, her husband, they all tell Marjorie that she's, that this idea has no legs, that no one wants a refrigerator, no one wants to buy frosted foods. And Marjorie says, I'm telling you, the American woman is ready for this. She is ready to feed her family convenient, healthy meals. She doesn't give up, and as generally tends to happen, eventually Marjorie gets her way. Her company, the Post Company, they buy Birdseye Frozen Foods, and they break open an entire new industry. We all have fridges. I drank orange juice this morning in upstate New York, so I have Marjorie to thank. So Marjorie really launched this empire, took it to the next level, and fundamentally changed the American way of life. And so that all begins in Battle Creek. It all begins because her father was being treated by Dr. Kellogg. And it's a fascinating piece of American and global history that, while everyone might know pieces of it, I don't know that everyone knows just how fully ingrained in our daily lives Marjorie's insights and business acumen and legacy truly were. And so it was fun to tell that story.
Well, it is interesting because when she was there in Battle Creek with her parents, there were some life lessons that she was learning, I think primarily from her father. Yeah. And those carried through her entire life. And I think there are a couple that, if you could tell our audience about, really motivated her throughout her many years.
Absolutely. Well, Marjorie was the only child of C.W. Post and Ella. They never had a son, and so C.W. Post decided very early on he was going to raise her like his son. And so while this was not the norm for the time period, he wanted her to be as well versed in the business side of things as in the ladies hosting, society bride side of things. And so he didn't want her to just have a life of getting married, being a debutante, getting married and having, babies and hosting great parties. She did host great parties. She did have children.
Big party.
She did get married 4 times, but she also was a smart woman and a free thinker and made history by joining the board of her company and being the first woman ever to do so of that major corporation. And people joked that had she been a man, she could have run US Steel. I think if she were alive now, we'd all want to vote for her for president, but she was very much a product of her time while also daring to dream bigger. And I think that that was in large part because her parents and her father really ingrained in her the work ethic and the competence and the capability to think for herself, and to think beyond just maybe what could have been stifling societal the stifling societal framework. And the other thing was people always said that she maintained her salty, down to earth Midwestern demeanor throughout her whole life, whether she was hosting the president at Mar-a-Lago or curtsying before the Queen in England. She was just known for being approachable. She had a down to earth kind of sharp sense of humor at times. She treated everyone with decency and dignity. And I think a lot of that certainly came from her upbringing and from just, she was the product of her family.
Well, I did notice that in your book, as does Deborah, that you write in the first person singular.
Mhm.
And was it difficult writing in the first person narrative from someone who is actually relatively recent in our past versus your other novels where you have more historical figures, 100 more so years ago?
Yeah, it was the first time I've ever written in first person, and I think the reason it came to me in first person is because I was able to absorb so much of Marjorie's voice. Because, as you said, she is such a recent figure. Her home in Washington, D.C., one of her final homes, Hillwood, is now a museum. And there is a full staff of PhDs and curators and archivists who are dedicated all day, every day to preserving her legacy and preserving her papers and her personal items and her photos and her furniture. Her daughter, Dina Merrill, the great movie star, said you could walk into Hillwood and sit down to dinner with mother. That is how well it's preserved to just really still maintain Marjorie's spirit. And so I feel like she was accessible as a result of that. There's just so much documentation on nearly every day of her life versus some of the other women I've written about who've been dead for hundreds of years and who have entire moments in their historical record where there are just gaping holes. So it's a blessing and a curse because the holes are where you get to play as the writer of historical fiction. This was a lot more clearly documented and defined, and family members of Posts who are present for some of the conversations that are in this book are still very much alive and came to some of my book talks. So there was this added pressure to get it right and to do justice to the history, but also she came to me in this immediate way because I had so much access to just her life, her homes, her stuff. I stayed in Camp Topridge, her New York home up in the Adirondacks. I slept in her bedroom, which was an unbelievable, surreal, like pinch me moment in life. I felt like the guards were going to have to come in and escort me out of the museum at some point. But I looked at her brush and I saw her hair still in the brush. There was just, which I will always be so grateful to the Crow family for. They own it now, it's privately owned, for allowing me to go. But because of all of the research and because of Hillwood and because of Topridge and because of the recent documentation of the history, she just came to me in a very immediate way, and the first person made sense.
Well, now, Deborah, you're also writing in the first person narrative, but you're in fiction. So one would think, well, I can make up anything I want. But how do you sort of put circumscriptions or boundaries around your characters because they have to come to life and seem real as well?
It's a great question. And I just read a book by Alice McDermott called What About the Baby, which is really about writing. And she's a wonderful writer. And she says in nonfiction, the effort, what you have to do in nonfiction is include everything. It must be included. And in fiction, because there is no inbuilt limitation, the effort has to be to restrict, to put walls around it. So Reef Road is fiction, but it's based completely on a real murder in 1948 in Pittsburgh. And so there was a tremendous amount of research involved. It's based on the murder of my actual mother's best friend. And there is now a lot of material available about this murder because everything's uploaded to the internet. So I chose to put the writer's voice in first person because she is a very introspective, ruminative, you could even say obsessive individual, very fixated on this murder and the effect it had on her mother and herself. So it was very easy to hop into her head and stay there. The book alternates with other chapters that are in third person, the perspective of another person, the younger woman who lives on Reef Road, where a completely different storyline plays out. And so going between the 2 points of view with the 2 women, it actually helped me organize the book and distinguish the perspective I was in from one chapter to the next.
Well, I must say it was a tour de force because I got to know each of these women, but one from a personal perspective and then sort of from the outside in. Allison, as an example of your use of the first person narrative, you have Marjorie wondering, quote, how could I be a woman of such good fortune and yet have the worst luck of all when it comes to the men I love? And I think Casey's going to put up the photographs of her 4 husbands. 2 even shared the same first name. Going left to right, I hope I get this correct, is Edward Close, C-L-O-S-E. She was married from 1905 to 1919. The second was Edward Ned F. Hutton from 1920 to 1935. The next was Joseph E. Davies at the top on the far right from 1935 to 1958. And then the bottom right, hopefully you can see that, is Herbert A. May from 1958 to 1964. Now, I'm no psychologist, so I don't know what's going on with Marjorie and these 4 husbands, but how would you answer Marjorie's question to herself, which was, and yet I have the worst luck of all when it comes to the men I loved?
Which is pulled directly from the history. Somebody asked her that after one of her divorces, and she was as perplexed as you are. So one of the first things I discovered about Marjorie when I just was becoming obsessed with her and thinking that she was going to be my next leading lady was I learned about her time in the Soviet Union collecting the
I'm gonna have to call you back. I'm on Zoom.
I learned about the post-serial empire, and I learned about the 4 marriages. And when you dig into these 4 marriages, 4 very different men, 4 very dramatic love stories. And Marjorie, when you look at the first one with Ed Close, who's the grandfather of Glenn Close, by the way. So Glenn Close from his second marriage. So Glenn Close is it's lucky that he and Marjorie didn't stay married because otherwise she wouldn't be here. But when you look at that they got married, it was Edwardian. It was Downton Abbey era. She was a society bride in her teens. She was naive. She was beautiful. She was an heiress, and they barely knew each other. He proposed to her after a few days. And I don't want to give any spoilers because then folks won't have to read the book. But when you read the story and you see the circumstances under which he proposed and got married, you think, this just is not going to end well. You know, maybe you could be a summer romance, a summer fling nowadays, but to get married, you can see at the time, based on the circumstances of what's going on in Marjorie's life, why she falls headlong into love with this man. But Ed Close is a member of the 400. He's old East Coast money. He's pedigreed. She's this Midwestern heiress from a cereal company. In many ways, they did not have that much in common, and you see sort of what happens in the marriage. But the through line with each of these 4 men, I would say 2 of the men matched her in life force and power and strength of will, and they butted heads, and it was a power struggle. And 2 of these men, I think she just had so much more verve and vim and vigor and life force that she just kind of could steamroll them, and they felt that too. but you can see how she goes, if you connect the dots from one, why it then makes sense that E.F. Hutton, Ned Hutton, the father of Dina Merrill, when he and Marjorie get married, why he's the next great love in her life. And he was rumored by all, including the family members, to be the great love of her life. They're married in the 1920s. They're hanging out on Long Island's Gold Coast with the likes of F. Scott Fitzgerald. They are rumored that they are the inspiration for the Great Gatsby in some ways, because they were throwing the types of parties that F. Scott Fitzgerald was attending and writing about in Gatsby. And so that was very interesting and very heartbreaking, and I won't go into it. And then the third husband, she has this epic saga, and they go to Russia, and they're there for World War II. And then the fourth husband is, a bon vivant and an artist, and they have this great connection. So every time you root for her, every time you think this is going to be the one, this is going to be the happy ending, and every time for a different reason, it doesn't work out. But one of the things I loved most about Marjorie was her willingness to love, and her willingness to believe, and her willingness to stay open to love. And even though it's 4 different heartbreaks, in some ways, the vulnerability and the humility that came with those heartbreaks humanized her, because otherwise she had this perfect life. She had everything. But you know what? She was a human like us, and she had heartbreak, and she had hardship, and her marriages were not ideal, and her life was not perfect. And every time she is shattered by heartbreak, you see her and she's going to be okay. And she's going to be strong enough to get through it. And she grows through each one, and she grows in each marriage. And so for me, the great love story of this whole book, with the 4 marriages, with the father being larger than life, the great love story is ultimately the one she has with herself, and with stepping into her own identity as a woman who grows and evolves and becomes stronger with each passing heartbreak and each passing decade. And so the original title for the book was actually I Am Mrs. Post, because she keeps getting married, she keeps getting divorced,
interesting.
she keeps coming back to Marjorie Post. And a friend made a comment after her 3rd divorce to her, 3 times around the track, and now it's back to the post. And I just thought that was so clever and so good. And I was like, you know what? She's not Marjorie Close. She's not Marjorie Hutton. She's not Marjorie Davies or Marjorie May. She's Marjorie Merriweather Post. And that is the story. That is I write about a lot of women who had unhappy marriages, but they lived in eras where divorce wasn't an option. For her, it was scandalous. It wasn't, it required bravery on her part to get divorced 4 times, much less even 1 time. But it was possible for her to keep pursuing and looking in the hopes of finding her happy ending. And so ultimately, it's not a failure. I don't see it, even though she has 4 marriages that fail. Ultimately, this is a story that's filled with love and filled with redemption and filled with happiness. And she has, at the end of her life, a lot of love and good to show for it, in spite of these 4 marriages. So I hope readers will see for themselves and see what they think. But it's fascinating, the 4 different.
Well, I think you've certainly become enamored of Mrs. Post. So we want to focus a little bit now on Palm Beach society. And some may cynically believe that Palm Beach society is composed of people with great wealth who give fabulous parties in massive mansions with other rich people, reminiscent of the Great Gatsby. Deborah, in Reef Road, you make a historical reference to James Vincent Sullivan, who built the 1926 so-called ham and cheese mansion designed by Morris Fatio. Do you think that people like this have contributed to this shallow view by some of Palm Beach society?
Well, some people attribute a certain phrase to Carl Hiaasen as having said it about Florida, a sunny place for shady people. But it was actually Somerset Maugham who said it about the French Riviera in the 1920s. But I really very much had that phrase in mind as I was writing Reef Road. I love Palm Beach. I live there. I was there in the pandemic, and it was such an otherworldly time. I mean, we all can picture exactly where we were. So I was writing all morning and then riding my bike up and down the island, and the lake trail was closed, the beaches were closed, there were police everywhere on the lake trail. So I would ride up and down the roads, and I wanted to focus on the north end of the island, the more regular part of the island, very neighborhoody, family oriented. And of course, I wanted to set something very dark in such a happy setting. I like that juxtaposition. But Sullivan and the Ham and Cheese House. So the writer goes down these research rabbit holes, and she talks a lot about a particular murder that happened in Palm Beach. And it was the incongruity that I found so delightful. This idea of talking about a house as the Ham and Cheese House, and then this grisly murder. I think it's the kind of thing that captures our imagination. So yes, I do think that people are always interested in exactly what Allison said with Marjorie Post. Her life is very grand, but she has the problems that we have. It's why we're very interested in the royal family of England, if we're still interested, because we want to see either how the mighty fall or how the mighty struggle in the same way that we do.
Well, Allison, having read your book a couple of times, I certainly agree that this oversimplified characterization of a Palm Beach socialite fits Marjorie. It does not. Yes, she was the wealthiest woman in the world in the United States in her day, who gave over-the-top parties and was even likened to F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby characters. Based on your book, though, I believe that Marjorie's lives, and we'll say the plural, lives, were very different from the superficial view. I can think of at least a dozen, but I wanted to focus on 3 of them: businesswoman, home builder, and most importantly, philanthropist. How did Marjorie, the businesswoman, and you've alluded to this earlier on, grow her family's business into a billion-dollar conglomerate? I think she was a risk taker. She understood what the public would like. You referred to frozen food stamps, the bird's eye acquisition. Do you think that's correct, that she was willing to take risks, or that she just understood what people needed and she could provide that?
Both. I think she was willing to take risks in every aspect of her life, whether it was her romantic life, her business, her philanthropy, her building. People mocked her for Mar-a-Lago being completely outside the mold of anything that was being done or convention. And she said, my wealth would have been a burden on my soul had I not found ways to use it to help others. And she said, there are others who have more than me. The only difference is I do more with mine. I put it to work. And those 2 phrases really stuck with me as I was exploring her character, because Marjorie wasn't happy and content in the moments of her life where she was a hostess and where she was living in lavish luxury without a greater cause or purpose. And for me, Marjorie was the most alive and the most fulfilled and on fire when she could pour herself into something that gave her meaning and that she felt passionate about. And so whether that's, in World War I, funding the largest wartime hospital in World War I France with the United States Army, or when it's World War II, she says, since I don't have a son to give to the cause, I'll give my Sea Cloud. And she gave her yacht, which then served with the US Navy. And when it was the Great Depression, she opened food kitchens and put away her jewels and threw herself into fundraising. And then she gave Mar-a-Lago to be a home for recovering soldiers and an occupational therapy location after World War II. So Marjorie, whatever was happening in the world, Marjorie found a way to not only get involved, but to have it be the most impactful and productive use of her time and her resources and her wealth that she could possibly use. And so she was an incredibly, in that way, inspiring woman to me. Like, I wish I could have a bracelet that said, what would Marjorie do? Because whatever the crisis was, Marjorie ran to it and found an efficient, good, helpful way to get involved. And she applied that same sort of discipline and integrity and work ethic to every aspect of her life. She was measuring the place settings of every plate and her fine china and silverware before dinner parties. She just had this hard driving, perfectionist sort of expectation that she put on herself to do the best and be the best and to do the most good. And so that did beautiful things for her philanthropy.
Well, you've mentioned a number of her homes, and there were several, and they're of course outstanding. But what was it about homes? I use the word home deliberately because I don't think she regarded them as houses. But what was it about a home? What did a home represent for her?
Yeah, and I didn't even write about some of the homes because I was like, oh, here's another chapter where Marjorie's building a fabulous home, and it was sort of like, how many times can I expect the readers to go along on these home build experiences with her? So I picked out some of the select, very, very fascinating ones to shine a lens or to shine a light. Mar-a-Lago, Camp Topridge in the Adirondacks, Hillwood, which is still a museum in Washington, D.C. I think Marjorie was very oftentimes, especially after the divorces, looking to put down roots and looking to feel safe in places, and also just knowing that the positions she occupied in society was she was this hostess, she was this grande dame of society, and she needed a fabulous home and nest and perch from which to really do that and to really play that role. And so she would, there was a joke when she was building Hillwood in DC. She wanted this great view of the monument, and her builders joked it was too difficult to move the French doors to get the view, so Marjorie just moved the Washington Monument. That was sort of just the kind of woman she was, and she put that into her home building as well. She had these visions, and then she threw everything she had, her energy, her intelligence, her money, her connections, her resources, at seeing those visions through to reality.
Casey, maybe you could show the images of Sea Cloud, which was an incredible private yacht, and also of Mar-a-Lago. I can't even begin to describe. I've seen photographs of this boat, yacht, which was, I think, the largest in the United States, maybe the world at the time. And one actually disappointment I had in your book, because the Historical Society could have given you a lot of images, was no photographs. And
Yes.
to come across and to see these, I mean, this yacht became a weather station, as you said, in World War II, but it was too expensive to maintain for the government. Mar-a-Lago, we have another photograph of that. The same, I think it's, this is in its probably not too long after it was built. Too expensive. Even the United States government couldn't afford to maintain it. But if there's one criticism I have of your book, it would have been these images. I think that we could have helped you with that. And I know you acknowledge the research staff in your book, and we really much appreciate that. But we have a lot of photographs of this era, and perhaps could have added a little dimension to the book. The last topic, and you've spent some time on this, is her philanthropy. And very recently, as you might recall, there was a ball here in at Mar-a-Lago to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Salvation Army. And Marjorie had an association with them going back many years. 1922, I think, is when the Salvation Army came to Palm Beach. And that was the year I think she started building Mar-a-Lago. So that association was quite robust. But there is one thing that I found interesting is that, but for her, we might not have our Good Samaritan Hospital here in West Palm Beach. She felt it was too far a distance for people to go to Miami for healthcare. So I really appreciate her philanthropy there. We have a special guest, a good friend of mine, Bryant Sims. He is a fellow docent with me here at the Historical Society of Palm Beach County. And Bryant had the good fortune to be invited, there's Bryant as a young man, to some of the square dances at Mar-a-Lago. As I understand it, Bryant, she had a separate pavilion for square dancing. And I was hoping you could share some of your reminiscence of those parties.
Well, I had a neighbor that was a good family friend when I first came here, and of Marjorie Merriweather Post, and they were looking for young men that could dance. And both my parents were square dancers. I was just out of the Navy and out of law school, and so I was invited, and I met her. But I'd also had the opportunity when I was in the Navy during the Dominican crisis. Our ship was a flagship behind in a little cove in Dominican Republic behind the Sea Cloud. This Trujillo had bought the Sea Cloud from her, So I had the opportunity to go aboard. And when I met her, just spoke with her one time, I told her that I had been aboard the Sea Cloud and that it was still magnificent. It was not a boat, it's a ship. Because in the Navy, anything that is above 150 foot is not called a boat, it's called a ship. So she was impressed about that. She looked like my mother in her crinoline skirts dancing. So we would have squares, and I can't remember if there were 4 or 6 couples, and there would be a caller, and it was a lot of fun. And she'd have a buffet. Very gracious woman, lovely. I would consider her handsome, just a lovely, lovely lady. I also attended. She did the Red Cross balls at the Breakers, and she would use her plane, the Merriweather, to fly down ambassadors and the Marine Corps Honor Guard. They would, and big announcements, and the Marine Corps Honor Guard would walk in, and the announcer would announce the ambassadors from the various countries, all sponsored and supported by Marjorie Merriweather Post. So it was a wonderful period for a young man.
Very exciting. Is
Is
this a very good depiction of Marjorie? Because she seems to be
Yeah.
smiling here at her square dance.
Yeah, in fact, in the photograph on the left is her daughter, Dee Dee Merrill. So
Yeah.
yeah, and I also had a chance to meet Dee Dee because I was an attorney for the film shot the pilot, which starred Cliff Robertson in town,
Mhm.
and so I had a chance to meet Dee Dee, and we would have dinner together. So I was very fond of her. She's very nice, lovely, lovely, lovely lady.
Well, it looks like everybody's having a pretty good time there, Brian. Thank you for sharing that.